Harlem had rulers long before Frank Lucas arrived, but none would leave a mark like him. He didn't seize power with violence or spectacle. He seized it with intelligence, observation, and discipline. By the early 1970s, he controlled heroin distribution across New York City with precision few could match. Harlem didn't just follow Frank Lucas, it depended on him. Before we dive into this story, let us know where you are watching from. And if you love true crime cases, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the next episode. Frank Lucas was born in 1930 in La Grange, North Carolina, a town where authority was unpredictable and justice selective. For black families, survival was a constant calculation. Words were measured, actions were limited. Frank's parents worked tirelessly, but their labor didn't translate into security. He grew up watching men endure humiliation and women suppress ambition simply to survive. The harshest lesson came early. Life could be taken without explanation. As a teenager, he witnessed a public execution of a black man accused of a minor crime. No trial, no defense, no mercy. The spectacle taught him an unspoken rule. Morality offered no protection, only leverage mattered. By 16, Frank left North Carolina with stolen money in hand. He didn't leave because he wanted freedom, he left because he refused powerlessness. When Frank arrived in Harlem, New York in the 1940s, he entered a complex ecosystem. The streets weren't chaotic, they were governed by unspoken rules. Power existed quietly, often behind closed doors. Violence was strategic, not performative. Frank started at the bottom, running numbers, delivering messages, and observing. He didn't chase attention. He chased patterns. Who controlled money? Who controlled supply? Who had police protection? Who made decisions behind closed doors? At the center of Harlem's underworld stood Ellsworth "Bumpy" Johnson, a man feared not for his fists but for his intelligence. Bumpy negotiated with the Italian mafia, maintained relationships with politicians, and enforced order without unnecessary bloodshed. Frank learned quickly, survival didn't come from aggression, it came from understanding systems. Frank Lucas earned Bumpy's trust through reliability. He followed instructions precisely, never stole, and spoke only when necessary. Bumpy taught him that discipline mattered more than force, and that control of supply was more important than control of territory. Under Bumpy, Frank understood one principle that would define his life. The man who controls the source controls the streets. Frank absorbed these lessons quietly, preparing for the moment he would no longer be in someone else's shadow. In 1968, Bumpy Johnson died suddenly from a heart attack. His death left a power vacuum in Harlem. Lieutenants assumed leadership, rivals tested boundaries, law enforcement expected violence. Frank Lucas did not act like others. He did not fight. He did not announce himself. Instead, he focused on the one thing Bumpy had emphasized above all else: supply. At that moment, Frank realized the traditional heroin trade was inefficient. Drugs passed through too many intermediaries, increasing cost and reducing purity. He saw an opportunity to do something no one had done before: bypass the mafia entirely. The Vietnam War created a unique logistical opportunity. Military shipments moved constantly between Southeast Asia and the United States, often with little oversight. Frank realized he could access heroin at its source in Thailand and Laos. By eliminating middlemen, he could reduce cost, increase purity, and control distribution from production to street. He didn't ask for permission. He calculated risk. He relied on corrupt military contacts and overseas connections. His system was invisible, efficient, and unprecedented. By 1970, Frank had established a direct pipeline for heroin. He branded his product Blue Magic, ensuring consistency, quality, and reliability. Other dealers diluted their product. Frank's heroin was pure and potent, Customers noticed immediately, dealers quickly followed. He didn't sell through chaos, he sold through trust. Harlem came to depend on him. At this point, Frank Lucas was no longer just a dealer. He was an institution, Harlem's king in all but name. Frank structured his empire like a business. Money flowed upward. Orders flowed downward. Roles were clear. Discipline was enforced. Corruption wasn't accidental, it was methodical. Police officers, airport staff, and military contacts were compensated reliably. Frank understood that predictability maintained loyalty better than fear. His system moved efficiently, silently, and profitably. For years, Frank avoided attention. He dressed modestly. He drove ordinary cars. He avoided nightlife and publicity. Law enforcement looked for chaos. Frank delivered the order. This invisibility allowed him to consolidate power, while others remained distracted by street-level arrests and mafia infighting. By the early 1970s, Frank Lucas controlled heroin distribution across Harlem, Newark, Detroit, and Washington, D.C. Millions of dollars flowed weekly. Harlem depended on him, dealers depended on him, law enforcement didn't know him. Frank's discipline, strategy, and insight made him arguably the most powerful drug kingpin in New York history. But even kings make mistakes. Visibility would soon challenge his invisibility and the very empire he built. By the early 1970s, Frank Lucas had mastered Harlem, but he didn't see Harlem as an endpoint. He saw it as a base of operations. Expansion required strategy. Most drug empires expanded through violence. Frank expanded through logistics. He didn't fight to conquer streets, he supplied them efficiently. Detroit, Newark, and Washington, D.C. had demand. Local dealers were inconsistent. Frank's product, Blue Magic, was pure, potent, and reliable. Demand followed supply. Expansion wasn't chaotic. It was deliberate. Territories were chosen carefully. Dealers were trained to prioritize consistency. Payments were methodical. Frank's empire became more like a corporation than a criminal network. One of Frank Lucas's most infamous innovations was the method he used to import heroin from Southeast Asia: military coffins. During the Vietnam War, coffins carrying fallen American soldiers were transported with minimal inspection. Law enforcement avoided interference due to respect and protocol. Frank didn't invent the idea to desecrate the dead. He identified a system blind spot. By working with corrupt military personnel, he arranged for heroin to be hidden in shipments of equipment, furniture, and coffins. These shipments entered the United States under the guise of legitimate military cargo. This method allowed Frank to bypass mafia intermediaries entirely. It reduced cost, ensured higher purity, and gave him unprecedented control over the supply chain. The Italian mafia dominated heroin distribution in New York, but Frank Lucas didn't compete with them openly. He circumvented them. Initially, they underestimated him. A local operator couldn't possibly replace their networks. But as Blue Magic gained popularity, they realized a new kingpin was operating outside their rules. The mafia expected negotiation. Frank refused. He relied on logistics and direct connections with suppliers. By the time they understood the threat, his system was too entrenched. Frank had created a parallel supply chain, making him independent and nearly untouchable. Blue Magic's success wasn't just about purity, it was about predictability. Customers knew exactly what they would receive. Dealers knew exactly how much product would arrive and when. Frank's organization controlled timing, pricing, and distribution with precision. Competition faltered because their product could not match reliability. Violence became unnecessary. The streets submitted to efficiency, not force. Harlem itself became a model of control. Problems were addressed quietly. Corruption was predictable, and the flow of heroin became a near-routine fixture of daily life. Frank organized his empire with corporate logic. Clear hierarchy. Street-level dealers had supervisors. Supervisors reported to higher-level managers. Managers reported directly to Frank. Compartmentalization. Few people knew the full picture, limiting leaks. Financial discipline. Cash flows were controlled and monitored. Loyalty through payment. Protection money and bribes were systematic, reliable, and professional. Unlike chaotic criminal organizations, Frank's network prioritized efficiency over intimidation. This approach minimized violence while maximizing profit and influence. Frank understood the limits of law enforcement. They responded to chaos, not order. Arrests at street level rarely penetrated his organization. Predictable corruption and compartmentalization shielded him from detection. His invisibility became his greatest weapon. While other kingpins drew attention through flamboyance and violence, Frank remained nearly invisible, quiet, disciplined, and precise. Frank Lucas's control of Harlem went beyond heroin. He created a system where everyone, from dealers to consumers to corrupt officials, operated under predictable rules. Violations were rare and punished quietly. Payments were regular. Loyalty was maintained through consistency, not fear alone. This predictability gave him authority. Harlem wasn't just supplied by Frank Lucas, it functioned as part of his system. Streets, neighborhoods, and dealers operated within his invisible hierarchy. Branding was revolutionary for the heroin trade. Frank named his product Blue Magic, ensuring that customers recognized purity and potency. Dealers knew exactly what they were distributing. This consistency created demand-driven loyalty. People didn't just buy heroin, they asked for Blue Magic. Even competitors couldn't compete. They sold diluted heroin. Frank's product sold itself. Harlem's heroin market had centralized around one man, one brand, and one disciplined empire. Growth introduced new risks. New cities required new contacts and protection systems. Payments had to be coordinated across borders. Corruption networks had to be extended methodically. Frank addressed these challenges by applying the same principles he used in Harlem: compartmentalization, discipline, and predictable incentives. Expansion didn't require violence because he built a network that depended on him. By the mid-1970s, Frank Lucas controlled heroin not just in Harlem, but in multiple major cities. Millions of dollars flowed weekly through his organization. Harlem streets, and increasingly the nation, operated on his schedule, his supply, and his rules. Frank's empire was unlike anything the city had ever seen. It wasn't chaotic, it wasn't flashy, it was efficient, disciplined, and absolute. Even other criminal organizations recognized it. Frank Lucas had become a kingpin without challenging anyone violently. But as with all empires, growth carried risk. The same visibility that allowed him to dominate would soon attract the attention of federal authorities. And that attention would be the beginning of his empire's undoing. Frank Lucas had built his empire on precision, discipline, and invisibility. For years it worked. Law enforcement focused on chaotic street-level dealers, the mafia's violent turf wars, and routine arrests. But no system is foolproof. Success breeds attention. Frank's empire had grown too large to remain completely hidden. Millions of dollars moved weekly. Shipments crossed state lines. Luxury items and real estate drew notice. Patterns emerged. Observers began to connect the dots. The very structure that had made Frank untouchable now made him traceable. Initially, local police investigated Harlem's heroin market. They discovered that street-level arrests were ineffective. Dealers were arrested, but shipments continued, and profits flowed upward. The evidence pointed to a centralized system. Someone at the top was orchestrating it. This led to federal agencies taking interest. DEA agents, IRS investigators, and prosecutors collaborated to build a case. They focused on logistics and finances, the heart of Frank's operation. The investigation revealed unusual patterns. Shipments consistently arrived from Southeast Asia. Products were unusually pure. Corruption existed in multiple institutions: military contacts, airport officials, and customs personnel. Law enforcement realized that Frank had bypassed traditional mafia routes. He wasn't just a local dealer, he was running a national pipeline. Surveillance intensified. Every contact, every courier, and every financial transaction became a potential lead. Even the most disciplined organizations face vulnerability. Frank's reliance on predictability, compartmentalization, and paid protection was effective, until external pressure increased. Corrupt officials were questioned, transferred, or replaced. Some dealers were arrested and pressured to provide information. The first cracks came at the edges. Lower-level members began talking, providing investigators with names, locations, and methods. Investigators didn't arrest Frank immediately. They aimed to dismantle his network first. Warehouses were raided, couriers were stopped, cash and heroin were seized. Each arrest revealed more about the empire's structure, but Frank remained largely insulated for a time. Yet the net was closing. The more the investigation progressed, the harder it became to hide. Loyalty in criminal enterprises is often fragile. While Frank maintained strict discipline, fear of long sentences eroded loyalty. Some associates cooperated quietly. Others waited until they were threatened by the law. Even a meticulously structured empire can unravel when insiders provide information. Frank Lucas had always believed he could replace anyone, but the simultaneous pressure from law enforcement and betrayal made replacement impossible. One of the key figures in pursuing Frank was Richie Roberts, a New Jersey detective known for refusing bribes and working systematically. Roberts followed the money, not rumors. He mapped networks, traced financial flows, and used the arrests of low-level members to gather intelligence. Unlike other officers compromised by corruption, Roberts provided consistency and persistence. He was the kind of investigator Frank had carefully avoided in his rise. Frank Lucas relied heavily on cash. Couriers transported large sums. Payments to corrupt officials were systematic. Real estate and luxury purchases were frequent. Scale betrayed him. Even with compartmentalization, repeated transactions created detectable patterns. Investigators began targeting assets. They mapped purchases, monitored movements, and tracked cash flows. The operation that had been invisible was starting to leave a trail. In January 1975, federal agents arrested Frank Lucas at his New Jersey home. They seized hundreds of thousands of dollars in cash. The arrest shocked Harlem and the broader criminal underworld. Frank's carefully maintained invisibility had failed, not because of violence or rivalry, but because the system had adapted and closed the gaps he had exploited. With Frank in custody, his empire began to unravel rapidly. Supply chains collapsed. Dealers competed violently for territory. Corrupt officials distanced themselves. The streets Frank had controlled with precision, and discipline descended into chaos. Even his closest associates couldn't maintain the structure he had created. The king was gone, and the kingdom fractured almost immediately. For the first time, Frank Lucas had no leverage. Money couldn't buy silence. Discipline couldn't restore loyalty. Supply control was meaningless behind bars. The empire he had built, one of the most disciplined and powerful in New York's history, had disappeared. And Frank faced a decision that would determine whether he survived or succumbed entirely to the system he had once outsmarted. Frank Lucas had ruled Harlem with discipline, precision, and invisibility. Now he faced a system that had finally caught up with him. Arrested in 1975, he confronted years of charges: drug trafficking, conspiracy, tax violations, and more. For the first time in his life, Frank realized that intelligence alone could not protect him. The empire he had built could not exist without his active leadership. Behind bars, he had no leverage, no supply control, and no protection. To survive, he would need to make a choice that went against everything his life in Harlem had taught him: cooperation. Frank Lucas did not cooperate out of remorse. He cooperated out of calculation. He understood his greatest remaining asset was knowledge. Knowledge of his organization, corrupt officials, and systems that allowed him to operate undetected. By sharing this information, he could reduce his sentence. He could regain some control over his future. Frank's decision marked the beginning of a new chapter, from kingpin to informant. Frank's testimony rocked New York law enforcement. Police officers, narcotics detectives, customs officials, entire networks of corruption were exposed. He didn't just provide names, he explained the structural methods behind the bribery and complicity, how payments were standardized, how silence was enforced, how loyal officers were isolated. His cooperation led to dozens of arrests, convictions, and resignations. Departments were embarrassed publicly, and systemic vulnerabilities were laid bare. Frank Lucas, once the target, had become an instrument of accountability. Ironically, the man responsible for flooding Harlem and other cities with heroin became essential to law enforcement. Without Frank, many cases of corruption and smuggling would have remained hidden. Agencies accepted the deal not because it was morally right, but because it was effective. Frank's sentence was reduced dramatically. From decades in prison, he faced only a fraction of the potential time. Cooperation came at a personal price. In the underworld, informing is unforgivable. Loyalty cannot coexist with betrayal. Frank understood this. When he left prison, he returned to a world where his past allies were gone, enemies had multiplied, and respect had been replaced with suspicion. The very empire he had built could no longer shield him. Survival had a price, and it was exile from the criminal kingdom he once ruled. Despite his cooperation, Frank's instincts drew him back toward familiar patterns. Authorities soon noticed suspicious activity, leading to another arrest for drug-related offenses. The system he once exploited was no longer something he could manipulate. Frank faced additional prison time. It became clear, the streets that had once obeyed him would never welcome him again. In his later years, Frank Lucas reflected on his life with clarity. He acknowledged the damage his empire had caused: neighborhoods ravaged by addiction, families destroyed, and generations affected. Yet he also emphasized understanding systems. He didn't create demand, he exploited it. He remained disciplined in thought, analyzing the intersections of power, corruption, and opportunity, even as his personal influence faded. The heroin market Frank dominated no longer existed in its old form. New drugs, decentralized networks, and escalating violence had replaced the structured, disciplined empire he had built. Frank's methods, efficiency, predictability, supply chain control, were impossible to replicate in the changing criminal landscape. He had survived longer than almost anyone else, but survival was not triumph. His empire was gone. His influence was history. Frank Lucas's story is remembered as a legend and cautionary tale. To some, he is a symbol of ingenuity and resilience, a man who bypassed the mafia and outmaneuvered institutions stacked against him. To others, he is a symbol of destruction, a reminder of the human cost of crime. Both perspectives miss a critical truth. Frank Lucas did not seek to revolutionize the world. He mastered it, exploited it, and ultimately faced the consequences.